This event was planned in collaboration with Blair Paulik, is that right? Pollock, sorry. Mark Jankowski, Alex Smith, Kara Warner, and Bob Johnston of the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, also known as SETAC. I'm going to turn the time over now to Blair to introduce our speakers.
All right. Well, thank you, Linford. Thank you to everyone at OMSI for making this possible tonight. We would not be here, of course, in OMSI without the help of the OMSI folks. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of them for enabling us to make this happen. My name is Blair Paulik. I am an environmental toxicologist at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I am also a longtime volunteer at OMSI. And I am also a longtime volunteer with Ctac, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. So this event was made possible by a collaborative effort between a small group of folks from Ctac, and then with the help of our collaborators here at OMSI. So I wanted to give a brief overview of Ctac, just because, again, we wouldn't be here without our Ctac team. So Ctac, like I said, is the, or like Linford said, is the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. So it's a niche professional society for environmental toxicologists and chemists around the world. But one of the things that Ctac does is plans conferences and opportunities for those environmental professionals to get together. But in concert with that, we also try to do things like this, community outreach events, because I know for me, connecting with the people who our science affects is one of the most important parts of the work that we do. Because if people don't know about the research that we're doing and all of the good things we're doing to protect the environment and public health, then what's the point? So that is Ctac. And so again, thank you to OMSI, thank you to Ctac. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to our first speaker. So our first speaker is Kaci Buhl. Kaci Buhl is an associate professor of practice in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology at Oregon State University. After 10 years coordinating the National Pesticide Information Center, she now directs the statewide pesticide safety education program in Oregon, and co-leads 2 national programs that create educational materials for professional pesticide applicators and healthcare providers. So thank you, Kaci.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you. You're so quiet today, so I want to make sure you know you're allowed to talk. I'm here to have a conversation with you. I'm so excited to be here today. When you think of pesticides, I wonder if you think first about big agriculture, DDT, or Agent Orange. Well, I'm Kaci Buhl. I work at OSU, and I got into pest management to help feed the world. I thought if there was more food, there would be less suffering. But as I learned more about entomology and weed science, that's a real class. I had to convince my parents that's a real class. Weed science. Also, plant pathology and ecology itself. I came to realize pest management is everywhere because we are in competition for food, water, and shelter. But it's not always a case of us versus them. There has been a change in pest management science, just even in the 20 years that I've been in the biz. We used to talk about controlling pests, eradicating them. And we used to call pest control operators an exterminator. But those terms are out of fashion. We don't try to exterminate pests anymore or control them. We try to manage them. And I think the next transition will be recognizing their role in ecology and trying to find synergies with the species with which we share space. Now, if you want to start our talk today just thinking that it would be so easy if we could just ban pesticides and replace them with organic alternatives. I'm going to show you some examples why that gets difficult. This is a press release from the Oregon Department of Agriculture just last month. I guess it was 6 weeks ago now. And this is happening about once or twice a year now. where they find an organic pesticide product has been adulterated with heavy-duty pesticides. The only reason we're finding this out now is because we test every batch of cannabis before it's sold for recreational or medicinal use. We've never tested every commodity, every batch of a commodity before. So now we found these situations where we test some cannabis and we find, say, malathion or chlorpyrifos or permethrin or glyphosate, come back to the grower and say, you used something you weren't supposed to use. No, I didn't. I promise. This is the only product I used. So then they test the product and they find that it actually has some heavy-duty pesticides in it. So I guess my message is, if you have an organic product that works wonders, it may not be that organic. The next one I want to bring up is homemade remedies. There are about 1,000 recipes on Pinterest where you can find out how to make your own homemade insecticide or bug killer, this or that. And it often involves vinegar, soap, salt, ammonia, lots of different things that you can find under the kitchen cabinet. Poison Control has reported an increase in eye exposures with vinegar. Even the 8% acetic acid vinegar that we use in our kitchens requires goggles, according to the safety data sheet. It is that toxic to the eye. But since it comes from our kitchens, we think it's low risk, and we tend to use those things a little more wantonly than we should. This one came out just recently, and it's been on my mind, so I wanted to share it with you. Glyphosate. I hesitate to say the word, but I give a lot of talks about glyphosate. I talk a lot to pesticide applicators who use a lot of glyphosate. That's the active ingredient in Roundup that has been in the news a lot. And a lot of municipalities have been talking about banning glyphosate. So they were able to do a meta-analysis looking at what happened in those municipalities after regulating glyphosate. And it tends to be replaced with things that cause more environmental damage or more worker risk. So these issues are not simple. In fact, we use pesticides all the time, even us that we're not in big agriculture, most of us. But we use pesticides in our homes to kill germs, in water, on surfaces. We use pesticides to protect our property from insect, mold, and plant damage. We use mothballs, sprays, and baits to kill intruders. And for each of these applications, we perceive a benefit. But there is no acceptable risk in the absence of benefit. This is an important idea I want to talk about today. I see this concept in action often. I used to work for 15 years at the National Pesticide Information Center. And callers who were the most irate about pesticides often complained that the application was pointless, without benefit. For example, who cares about dandelions in the lawn? He's giving me cancer. Similarly, I have a dear friend who eats only organic food, but she hires a pest control company to treat her home every spring for ants. Pesticides are bad, but the ants drive her crazy. Benefit, risk. I could show you some psychology studies that back this up, but I don't have time. The truth is, nothing is risk-free. So how do we make decisions? Well, maybe we should measure the benefit in some kind of units and balance that against risk in some kind of units. Well, if we did that, we would have to make sure that whatever we're balancing, we do that with a reasonable certainty of no harm. That's actually a phrase that shows up in the law in the 1996 Food Quality Protection Act. A reasonable certainty of no harm. There's no safety standard. It's a reasonable certainty of no harm. This is one of the reasons I coach a lot of people to get out of the habit of saying safe or not safe, toxic or not toxic. Those are misleading ideas. So how do we do this? Well, let's try to measure it because we're scientists, right? We're going to find a way to do this with math. Let's take the highest dose with no effect. Now, how do we find the highest dose with no effect? We have to do a lot of studies. A bunch of studies are required for pesticides before they're allowed to be registered on the market. They do short-term studies. Let me see, I made a list. battery of acute toxicity studies using animals. They also do chronic exposure measured with lifelong exposure studies, again in animals. They look for cancer, reproductive effects, developmental effects, birth effects, neurological effects, endocrine effects, short-term, long-term, multi-generational studies. Out of all those studies, they look for the highest dose that showed zero effect. Okay. So then we think that big dose is a dose that we could be exposed to as humans every day for the rest of our lives with with a reasonable certainty of no harm, because that's the dose that showed no effects. But we go further and we divide by 10 because animal studies are not human studies. Then we divide that dose again by 10 because some people are sensitive. So let's say this initial dose was 10,000 units. We divide by 10, it's 1,000. We divide by 10 again, it's 100 units. Now we're saying the allowable risk is 100 units, and that's a dose. That's the dose we want to keep it down to. All right, now, how do we measure risk? Well, this equation is known as the risk equation in risk assessment. Can you guys see my, no, you can't. Hey, where's that pointer? Thank you. Okay, appreciate it. All right. So one way we could do this is to measure the toxicity to humans and the exposure to humans, multiply them. Do that same thing for animals. And I just put in units to demonstrate here. But if we add these up, that's equal to 110 units, which is more than we were allowed under the risk assessment paradigm. So what do? Well, you could pay attention to this unit and reduce the exposure to humans, take it from 9 to 8 by removing use sites, or maybe you add requirements for PPE, personal protective equipment. When I say that removing use sites, they can be really surgical about this. So if, for example, they find the risk to children is too high, they take out uses that children eat a lot, like apples, because they eat a lot of apple juice. But they might keep uses on asparagus that kids don't eat a lot. Seriously, it's pretty cool. Anyway, so then once you get the risk down to 8, the exposure down to 8 for humans, the math works out. But I'm overgeneralizing, of course, and we do have actual real risk assessors in the room who can answer more detailed questions about this. But we need to ask ourselves, are we taking into account all of the possible effects? We didn't start looking for neurological developmental effects until about the 80s. We didn't start looking for endocrine effects functionally until the 90s. And then they didn't figure out how to do it for another 10 years. Thank you. What about mixture effects? With thousands of chemicals in our environment, there is no way we could ever do enough science to determine the outcome of each possible mixture by each route of exposure to each population with a unique diet and potentially cultural practices. For example, we use herbicides or weed killers on roadsides to keep the shoulders clear, which promotes vehicle safety, right? But when they did the risk assessment for that use, they assumed no one was eating roadside plants. They later learned that some indigenous communities make baskets from roadside plants, often using their mouths in the process. Well, we didn't know that. That's why we have to keep checking back in to revisit this balance. EPA revisits each pesticide registration on a schedule every 10 or 15 years, each time with an opportunity for public comment. We have to keep talking to the communities we serve. What populations did we miss? What exposure scenarios did we miss? Have the benefits been negated by new alternative methods? A lot of things in reality could change this equation over time, and we need to be listening to the communities we serve to hear that. And that's why we're here tonight. That's why we saved more than half of our time for conversations with you all. And with that, I just want to put this slide back up to generate our thinking. I'm going to stop and see what questions you have about all that. I tried to cover risk assessment in 10 minutes. All right, I'm prepared to answer questions. I'm going to pick up the mic and talk a little bit. Can I bring up questions for any of you? Yes, sir, up in the top.
Based on proven facts and process, would you choose to use a chemical pesticide or genetic modification in terms of risk?
Repeat the question.
Wow, okay, so I'm going to repeat the question back for our Zoom folks. Given food risk, you're focusing on dietary risk. Would I rather use a chemical pesticide or a genetically modified plant? Is that what you're asking? Okay.
Right.
So a genetically modified plant that would serve as an alternative to a spray is called BT corn or BT soybeans, BT cotton. And it's genetically modified to express a certain protein that we see in Bacillus thuringiensis that happens to be toxic to insects, but only when they eat it. So it's a pretty handy technology. But resistance is becoming a major issue because it's so handy that, like most things, we over-rely on those tools that work best. So which would I prefer from a dietary perspective? And normally I don't give an opinion because my opinion really doesn't matter. But I think from, because we need to be coming up with consensus ideas, I'm really pushing back against the idea that scientists are up on some pedestal or that we know more than you do. We all need to share information. The BT crops in particular have very low toxicity, practically immeasurable. In fact, those proteins don't go through the conformational change in our guts that would make it toxic to us. Instead, it only goes through that transformation in an alkaline gut, which insects have. So I think the toxicological risk for diet might be lower in this case for our BT crop. Perhaps, but it also depends on the type of chemical pesticide you use, right? Because some of them break down entirely before they get to the table. You have to be exposed to it in order to have a problem. And once you're exposed to it, it has to get in you somehow. And once it gets in you, it has to reach a target organ. And once it reaches the target organ, you get the idea, right? But I think some of the folks I've talked to at the center instead have an idea that the chemicals are coming to get them. And just being near them can be harmful. But we do have to be exposed. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of exposure,
Yeah.
I heard a statistic about like over 200 chemicals that babies are coming preloaded with out of the uterus because they're getting it through the umbilical cord.
And I should just repeat that back?
Yeah.
She wanted to share that she understands there may be as many as 200 man-made chemicals that come into a baby's system before they're even born, coming through the umbilical cord. And well, I haven't seen that number. It wouldn't surprise me. There are lots of bioaccumulating toxins that came into the channels of trade, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now we check for bioaccumulation, but it's a little too late for all that stuff that left the barn in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So there are persistent organic pollutants. There are things that kind of come into fashion every year. Things like PFAS, the polyfluoroalkylated alkyl substances are in fashion to pay attention to, but they've been here the whole time. There's some of those chemicals that you're talking about, yeah.
Question on Zoom.
Okay, and then you, okay? Yes, question on Zoom?
Can you explain more about why you think the term toxic should not be used and what terms we should use to describe compounds with elevated risk from exposure?
I love that question. Okay, the question was, can you explain more about why you think toxic is a bad word to be using and what we should talk about instead? Things are not simply toxic or non-toxic, and thinking that way has gotten us in trouble, I think, as a scientific community, and we've lost credibility with the audiences that we serve because we might say something is safe one day, not safe the next. How many articles have you read about coffee?
Zero.
Well, I've seen a bunch of them, right? Like 1 minute it helps with your memory, it prevents Alzheimer's, and the next minute it causes cancer. All those things are true, but we have to get better at talking about it. So instead of saying safe or not safe, toxic or non-toxic, we need to talk about risk and the things that affect it. Because that's something you can pull levers with. And if something is risky, low risk or high risk, then we can take steps to reduce the risk. But if something is safe or non-toxic, people use it like butter. Right? Like if I buy an organic product, pesticide product, then I don't have to read the label. Be careful with it, it's organic. You know I'm right. People do that, and they're looking for a mental shortcut. I do the same thing, looking for mental shortcuts. Like, how can I get through my day without having to be so very specific about everything? I can take a mental shortcut by picking a product that says safer choice on it, and then I don't need to read the label or keep it out of reach of children. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. So instead, we should talk about products presenting risks, low, moderate, high. Risks to who? Because the risks are different to different individuals. If something is high in inhalation toxicity, the risk to an asthmatic person is way different than it would be to a non-asthmatic person. So we need to talk about risk and things that affect it. And your question.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious if there's places in the world or other communities, scientific communities, or like communities of public practice that are addressing some of these things. So, for example, when I think about public transportation, I look to places like Japan that have public transportation to ski resorts and up to mountain areas, and I use that as a model to be like, okay, maybe one day we can get there in the US. And so I'm curious if you look to other places as a model, or even within the US, are there places that are taking more action or a little bit more progressive in their policies than others?
Okay, to repeat that question back, thank you for the question. She said, are there models or places where they're doing this better? And someplace that you could base this on. I want to answer in a couple ways. One, I want to mention Cuba, because Cuba was cut off from international trade for so long, they didn't have the same pesticide revolution the rest of us did. So they kept their IPM practices. So after the pesticide revolution, many scientists are going back to Cuba to look at their pest control practices that our generations forgot because we didn't need it after DDT. So for pest management, I would look to Cuba. For risk assessment, I don't know, there's different approaches to it. In the European Union, they take more of a precautionary approach, putting the emphasis of proof on the manufacturer, prove that it's safe. And in the United States, instead, we say, prove it's not safe. So the burden of proof is in a different place. Other ways of regulating risk, everybody does it a little different, which tells you it's based on subjective values. One of the things I think they have ignored so far is the benefits to well-being from pesticide use, benefits to social justice. Those are not incorporated right now. You must be thinking, what the heck? You're talking about. Well, what communities do you think might be more affected by agricultural pesticides than others? Agricultural workers, for one, who are more exposed to pesticides than a lot of other groups. I think pesticide applicators are number one. And that in that profession that I serve all the time, it is overrepresented with men, older men, and younger minorities. They're choosing that profession. So I'm keenly aware that they're exposing themselves every day. And I'm their professional mag. Wear your gloves, wear your mask, wash your hands, and protect your families. Because I've also talked to people who said, well, I had cancer now and I was an applicator for 20 years. Do you think it was related? No doctor's ever going to answer that question affirmatively or negatively because you can't tell, you don't know, but the risk is there. So let's be precautionary, and that's the approach I would discuss with my applicators, is more precautionary. There are probably risks from pesticide exposure that we haven't even figured out yet. So lower exposure is lower risk, based on that, right? Okay, I hope that was useful to start the conversation. Yes? Okay, I think we're ready for our next speaker.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kaci. I really enjoyed that. And I should say too, our whole goal with planning this event was to create what I think just happened, which is an opportunity for you all to engage directly with environmental professionals. So I'm very excited that we're here and that we're doing this. And I think Kaci kicked us off in a beautiful way. And thank you all for your questions on Zoom and here in person. It's very exciting for me personally and professionally to see this actually happening. So thank you. With that, let's move on to our next speaker. Diane Barton is the Water Quality Coordinator at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, where she provides technical expertise related to water quality, environmental toxics, and regulatory processes. Diane also serves as the chairman of the National Tribal Toxics Council, which is an EPA tribal partnership for the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. Diane holds a PhD in geochemistry from the University of Arizona and is a member of the Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa. Thanks. You got the Chippewa right, but not the Superior. So thanks. It's really nice to be here at OMSI SciencePub. I've never been to one. And this is the first time in 2 years that I've given a presentation in front of a live audience. And I've also never given a 10-minute talk before, a lightning talk. I'm really more of a 60, 70 slide sort of per lecture sort of person. So I'm trying to give you just one important takeaway in these 10 minutes and then leave time for questions. TED Talk advises speakers to start with a catchy phrase so that you're going to remember the most important thing about this talk. So here it goes. We need to talk about TSCA. TSCA is the Toxic Substances Control Act, and I hope to show you that it impacts your lives and your family's health possibly more than you know. And just like the character Bruno in Encanto, TSCA, while being one of the most powerful environmental laws, has been hidden from public view in the secret passages, and very few people want to talk about it. But let's talk about it and why it matters to tribes and why it ought to matter to you. You've probably all heard about the Clean Air Act and the accomplishments it has had in lowering pollutants since 1970, 50 glorious years in counting. You've probably all heard about the Clean Water Act and all it's accomplished since 1972, when dipping your hand in the Cuyahoga River looked like this. As long as it wasn't on fire, right? And now this is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. But what do you know about TSCA? TSCA was intended to be the primary means of regulating the production and use of industrial chemicals. And it should serve as a gatekeeper, for chemical use as it regulates over 86,000 chemicals. TSCA is also important because its authority transcends environmental media. Unlike the Clean Air Act, focused on air, and the Clean Water Act is focused on water, TSCA has the authority to look at hazards comprehensively throughout their entire life cycle. But it's been considered by many to be a failure. As you learned in the trivia, over 60,000 chemicals that were in use in 1976 were grandfathered with no testing required whatsoever. Risk and management control decisions by EPA had to contain cost-benefit analysis. Kaci fortunately talked about benefits, but benefits to who? The chemical industry? EPA had to make risk findings, but had no regulatory tools to require health and safety information from chemical companies. And EPA was required to choose the least burdensome. EPA could only require safety testing via rulemaking process, and companies could shield information from third parties, including the public, by declaring their chemical was confidential business information. TSCA in all that time banned and limited the production of only 5 chemical classes. Today, there's over 40,000 active chemicals in commerce, and about 400 new chemicals are introduced every year. So to see
what TSCA's current impacts, Kaci talked about PFAS. I think people here have heard about it. You just Google it. It's called the forever chemical. It's been used to make various products that are resistant to oil, stain, grease, water. It's a firefighting foam, food packaging. It's in your cosmetics. But these chemicals are very long-lasting and bioaccumulative and have spread through the environment. It's been the subject of a movie recently in 2019. And these headlines are just from some that I saw this from the last month. There's currently, PFAS in lobsters, PFAS in beef from Michigan, PFAS in milk, PFAS in Lake Superior fish. Your garden fertilizer has been measured with PFAS. So it's a current problem, and currently there's 669 PFAS chemicals on the TSCA inventory. So it's part of TSCA. And according to the California EPA, their website, I don't know if you can see it on here, but you can just Google California biomonitoring. Somebody asked about chemicals in infants. In the California biomonitoring program, they measured PFOA and PFOS, are kind of long chain for all you chemists in the audience, PFAS compounds in 100% of the people they tested. 100, everyone in this room has PFAS in their body. You don't have grease on your pants, but you do have PFAS in your body. So what's the benefit cost there? According to the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, PFAS compounds have been related to increased risks of kidney and testicular cancer, decreased birth weights, changes in liver function. You can look all that stuff up yourself. And then a few months ago, in October, EPA released a PFAS testing strategy as part of their PFAS roadmap. And this, for the first time, is going to require industry to do the testing that Kaci talked about and provide toxicity information to EPA so they can make judgments about the safety of these products. The first time, and PFAS came out, I think, in the late 70s. So what has given EPA new teeth in their TSCA work? And that is the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act of the 21st century. This act, one of these was a trivia question that didn't get read, but it was passed by the both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support in 2016, signed by President Obama. Risk evaluation is required to consider potential risks to human health and the environment and susceptible subpopulations. Fortunately, Kaci talked about that too. You're going to answer all the questions. The law emphasizes potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, and that's a touchstone for new TSCA. And so intent was Congress that wrote this law that this term, potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations, is used 18 times in the Lautenberg Act. It really has formed a new basis for risk evaluation in TSCA. It excludes consideration of costs and non-risk factors. It expands the category of people who have access to that confidential business information. It can now go to states and also to tribes. So since new TSCA was signed into law in 2016, and under the previous administration, EPA completed evaluations of 10 high priority chemicals, but only now is EPA tackling how to consider these potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations. So why do tribes in particular care about TSCA? For environmental contaminants, and particularly for those that bioaccumulate into tribal resources in the food chain, tribes probably represent potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations. And here's just a little blurb taken right out of the law. This graphic attempts to show how tribal lifeways are very closely associated with the environment through subsistence, harvesting of fish, game, and plants, cultural practices like pottery making and basketry, all that involve close reliance on the environment. In addition, tribal lands are oftentimes reliant on rural wells for water. But in EPA's evaluation of people's exposure to chemicals, which Kaci also talked about, even since new TSCA was implemented, the interaction of people with the environment has been evaluated through what's called what we look at as a recreational lens, possibly swimming, kayaking, boarding, paddleboarding, fishing, and then EPA calculates incidental ingestion of water that occurs during recreational activities. Tribal lifeways, however, are an ongoing exposure pathway to chemicals in the environment, and it's much more than recreational. Here, tribal people are netting salmon in the Columbia River, as they have done since time immemorial. Exposure to water and consumption of aquatic foods, in this sense, is not recreational or incidental, and it can result in much greater exposure than the general population. Fish consumption, for example, can be orders of magnitude higher than the general population for tribal people. And as you've seen in the Lautenberg Act, or I tried to tell you, it expressly mandates that EPA identify and evaluate chemical substances and for how they, for their greatest risk, and focused on potentially exposed, we talked a little bit about exposure, and susceptible subpopulation. Kaci talked about this too. So let's look at tribal susceptibility. Tribal health disparities can mean greater population susceptibility. Indian country is more likely to suffer from certain health conditions, more likely to get sicker, have serious complications, and die from them. This graphic is from Family USA 2018 using CDC data. Some of the leading diseases and causes of death among tribal people are heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and stroke. And every tribe has a different culture, geography, and government, and more. This graph shows the incidence of stomach cancers for tribal people, shown in the blue bar, and white non-Hispanics, shown in the purple bar, living on tribal lands or sharing a boundary with tribal lands. Across all geographies, tribal populations as a whole are at least twice as likely to die from stomach cancer as non-Hispanic whites, and three or more times likely if you live in Alaska, the Navajo Nation, or tribes in the Arizona area. Contaminated food and water has been identified as the primary cause of these gastric cancers, and it's often associated with poor sanitation and crowded living conditions. There's also poverty disparity that impacts the health of tribes as compared to the general population, regardless of location. Poverty rates for Native Americans, whether they live on reservation, the graph shows poverty rates for on-reservation or urban dwelling tribal members. But no matter what the choice, poverty is much higher for tribal people than the general population. And there's health effects associated, shown up there in the little box, associated with poverty, hypertension, which increases health conditions. So another health indicator that you might not think of that can be related to TSCA is older furnishings. Older furnishings can contain high levels of bioaccumulative flame retardants and potentially other types of treatment chemicals that are more likely to be entrained in dust and released to the environment through wear and tear. One example is PBDE. You may have seen some news reports on this maybe about 4 years ago from the Chicago Tribune. It's a bioaccumulative flame retardant that has not been banned by TSCA, but was voluntarily taken out of production, but even today is measured in fish and people in biomonitoring studies. The data in the graph indicates that Native Americans are far less likely to purchase furniture or to spend money on it. And we should also note that TSCA evaluations don't consider thrift stores as part of commerce. So legacy uses, okay, thanks, of a chemical is one that is no longer active in commerce, kind of like the voluntarily recalled flame retardants. Under the previous administration, all 10 risk evaluations ignored exposures to legacy uses of those chemicals. One of these was a flame retardant, just like PBDE, that was voluntarily pulled out of commerce but it's already banned throughout the world through the somebody who asked about this, banned throughout the rest of the world under the Stockholm Convention, but allowed in the United States primers. So legacy use is an environmental justice issue, and it needs to be included as part of classical risk assessments. Higher exposure to legacy products is not just in the home, but can be magnified by tribes' less protective disposal options and subsequent release to the environment from waste disposal. Slow water here. Okay. So on tribal lands that lack many safeguards, particularly in Alaska, where we have unlined landfills and community burning is common and legal, environmental releases occur from the disposal activities as well. But legacy product disposal was not assessed by the previous administration. Under the Biden administration, EPA is just now revising some of the TSCA risk evaluations that were done by the previous administration, and is now for the first time working on what they're calling fence line screening methodology to capture potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations. So I'm seeing this as a start of fulfilling the aspirations of new TSCA. So Lautenberg recognizes that protecting general populations is not the same as protecting all the populations. That's implemented in Lautenberg, stated clearly in Lautenberg. But we see that the cost and effort and time it takes to make a risk evaluation for every subpopulation increases the cost and the time it takes to do that. Capturing risks for everyone may not even be feasible. So if you're safety net, and by doing that, you can miss subgroups of populations that really are at risk, and tribes could be one of those. But for contaminants that are released to the environment, if tribes were evaluated first or recognized part of the process, possibly EPA could be doing one evaluation instead of 2, 3, or 10. But I want to stop here and give you a warning about new TSCA, because it also preempts the state authority to regulate chemicals. On the right-hand side of the screen is some data about state regulatory controls for flame retardants, and I think the other one is phthalates. So these states, including Oregon, throughout the nation, has implemented rules and regulations around the use of these chemicals. And if you want to talk about benefits that result from this sort of state authority, you can just look at health indicators for the rest of the United States. And you can look how these states compare to the states that don't have these regulatory rules about the use of toxics. So it's really, really important that the feds get this right, because they're going to come in after they do their risk evaluation, and states are not going to be able to change the findings of the federal review. So what can you do? Let's start talking about TSCA. You can go to regulations.gov right now, and if you put into the search bar, TSCA screening fence line, you'll see that EPA right now has written a report on how they're going to look at fence line communities, how they're for the first time going to be considering these potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations. So far, the Environmental Defense Fund thinks that the EPA approach is going to underestimate health risks. Earth Justice says that the approach fails to consider many ways communities are exposed. The American American Chemistry Council, on the other hand, kind of wants to go back to the historical approach and calling general populations at the fence line. I think they need to reread TSCA. But if you have an opinion, if you're for or make as toxicologists, you can go online and read that report and provide input. They're asking the public to let your voice be heard, and I think you should. The Tribal Toxics group, we submitted our letter into that website yesterday. So that's all. Thank you. Any questions? Casey's going to answer them. Yes. This is a Pacific lamprey. I think OMSI even has some exhibits, maybe years ago, probably before.
Yeah, I don't think we have them now, but yeah.
There are some at the zoo. Yes.
One very effective way to affect change, if communities, groups, individuals are harmed, is to take it through the courts under tort law. That says, I've been harmed, you show how, and you get a major settlement. I haven't seen any of that shown here, and it seems to be an avenue that could be quite effective if you want to affect change, because it costs the people that are promoting the problems having to pay out a bunch of money. So why are we seeing a lot of tort type of suits to protect those impacted negatively by this?
So the gentleman is asking about the use of tort law, which I think means payments back. There has been, and if I were allowed to give my 70-slide talk, I could have gone into this a little bit more, but EPA's, the previous administration's implementation of new TSCA has been litigated. The Ninth Circuit Court found that EPA failed to meeting the obligations of new TSCA and are currently requiring consideration of legacy uses of chemicals. So that legacy piece that I talked about was found to be missing. And so EPA's redoing some of those risk evaluations, and that's also why they're doing the expense line work too. And so the Environmental Defense Fund, I don't know, we have them, and Earth Justice, both are involved in lawsuits, primarily against EPA. I don't know if that's the same as tort law, where where somebody has to pay, the chemical company has to pay money. But
I have another example I can share.
oh, all right, good, thank you.
I'll come join you.
Come on, Kaci.
So I have a fun example I want to share with you just because it's kind of gossipy and I'm a nerd for this stuff. But so you might recall a few years ago that there were some groundskeepers that sued Monsanto because of glyphosate and cancer. And they got a huge settlement from a court, and then there were a couple after that, and then there were a few different law firms that actually started building class action cases. And that's, I think, what you're talking about. And there's a huge action potential to get into that kind of thing because there's so much cost up front. So guess what happened? So Bayer bought Monsanto. Bayer wants to do away with these lawsuits. They meet with the lawyer groups and say, okay, we'll pay for the cancers that already happened, but no more after that because we don't think glyphosate causes cancer. Well, a judge threw that out and said you can't limit the future litigation options for future litigants. So then they said, okay, we'll come up with our own risk assessment panel, big experts, and they'll decide if glyphosate causes cancer, and then we'll all follow what they say. Another judge threw that out and said, we have a risk assessment arm of the government. We don't need another one. So then, then Bayer says 90% of our lawsuits are coming from the U.S. lawn and garden market. So they just abandoned the market. They said, we're not going to sell products with glyphosate to the U.S. lawn and garden market anymore after January of 2023. And it has nothing to do with safety concerns. We're just tired of getting sued.
Yay.
Weird, right? Anyway, that's just my fun story.
I knew we could get you up here. Anything else? All right.
Actually, I have one question.
Yeah.
There was that slide about like 60-some thousand things, chemicals that were exempt from
Testing.
Testing.
They were grandfathered in 1970.
So it's exempt from being tested for those chemicals, like products from being tested for those chemicals. Right?
No. So that meant the ability for the chemical industry to provide toxicity information.
Got it.
So, and then the law didn't require the chemical companies to do any new testing. EPA had to use the data that was at hand in order to make their risk determinations. And if something was missing, they couldn't order that testing. That's changed. And EPA, under that PFAS rule, is now asking those companies to do toxicity testing.
Okay. That's
So-
I just need to clarify.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it was, a big gap in the rule, because they could only use the data that was already in the literature or owned by the company. So,
So that's enough, I'm sure.
yeah. Oh, I didn't repeat your question. Just ask me. Yeah, oh, good, sure.
Yeah, I was wondering, at one point, I don't know if it's still active, didn't they have a children's health environmental kind of big national coalition going on where they're trying to figure, because children are more exposed than adults to a lot of these things, and you touched on that. So, but didn't they have this database that they were building? You know what I mean? It's in children's environmental health.
I think it's, okay, so the questioner is asking about, I think it's the CHPAC, is that it?
That could be it.
Children's Health. Something.
Protection and
Protection. We're trying to get the acronym right.
Yeah.
And so during these first 10 risk evaluations, EPA did a tiger team on trying to solve this. How were they going to look at potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations? And they looked at that database for children's health, and our organization said, well, why aren't we looking at tribal children? Because that's really what the law mandates, protecting the most susceptible. And tribal children are eating fish, consuming water, living under these same conditions that I kind of breezed through here. And that really should be the baseline. And that's the argument that we are making. And I think fence line communities need to make, and not let the American Chemical Council argue that that they should go back to general populations at the fence line. I don't even know what that means. But you can tell there is a lot of money that gets, that is involved here in who's running the EPA or who's running these risk evaluations, I think. The chemical industry has a very, very powerful voice here. And so people need to log into regulation.gov. And if you happen to like a chemical, if you happen to, that's under review, you can find that, you put it in the bar there and say that you're for it under particular PPE or whatever it is. I think it should be a conversation. And if there's great benefit to the public, like putting the flame retardant that I talked about in children's pajamas and into the couches, into the rugs in the houses. And this was mandated by the state of California at one time. Those flame retardants were required, but it really didn't save many children. And I think the data that was used, this came out in the Chicago Tribune article, was false. The statements made when this was being talked about was based on false data. And so what was the benefit to the children of having flame retardants in your pajamas? We grew up in that age versus what the benefit was to the chemical industries are two different things. So when we look at benefits, we really got to break that apart and look at that closely. Okay, good. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Diane. Our next speaker is Lauren Wirtis. Lauren Wirtis is the Public Affairs Specialist for the Northwest region of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Her job includes talking to Oregonians and the media about the work DEQ does every day to protect Oregon's air, land, and water. She's a lifelong Oregonian with a background in environmental studies, urban planning, and community engagement.
Hi,
Hi, everyone. So I'm Lauren Wirtis. I'm the communications person for DEQ for the Northwest region, which is here in the Portland metropolitan area, as well as northern parts of the coast. And as Linford kind of mentioned earlier, this is one of the main things you probably know that DEQ does. We test your car. But I'd be remiss in my duties as a communications person if I didn't tell you that we also do a lot of other things. So we clean up properties that are contaminated because of the way they were previously used. We give rebates to people who are purchasing electric vehicles. We clean up and prevent oil and hazardous material spills. And then we monitor air quality all over the state. And air quality in particular is something I want to talk about, especially as it pertains to wildfires. And so, as you're probably hearing throughout this series of talks tonight, we're really asking a lot of questions about chemicals and how much is too much. And, you know, when it is too much, what do we do? And one of the main things, or one of the main ways that DEQ interacts with people on this topic is when it comes to wildfire smoke. So we issue air quality advisories for areas in Oregon when smoke reaches unhealthy levels. So how much is too much? And just a couple of reasons first why I want to talk about this. One is that as folks who've been living here for the past couple of years have probably experienced, wildfires are sort of here to stay. It's becoming more and more prevalent. I'll talk about all these things in more depth in a moment. And wildfire smoke can really impact your health in pretty serious ways, but it doesn't have to. And there are a lot of resources out there to help you figure out how to prevent exposure, as Kaci was talking about, one of the main things that creates risk to yourself and your family and your health. So as you can see in this graphic, over the past 10 years, we've been seeing more and more acres of land burned from wildfires. And this is big. As Blair mentioned in my intro, I'm a lifelong Oregonian. I remember when Oregon didn't have a wildfire season. I remember when that became a California thing that we thought they did down there. And then eventually I've seen it creep up into our state, and now it's becoming pretty prevalent. And even when wildfires aren't big here, the smoke from other neighboring states can still impact our air quality. And so if this is going to keep happening, we want to study it, we want to understand it, and make sure we can protect ourselves from it. So when we think about what is smoke, smoke is made up of a number of chemicals, but really when we're talking about smoke, we're talking about particulate matter, specifically PM 2.5. So this means particulate matter for particles that are 2.5 microns in size. Micron is kind of a weird term, but you can see in this graphic, you have a grain of sand, and that's 90 microns in size. You have like a strand of hair, which I always think looks like a sandworm out of Dune. That's like 50 to 60 microns in size. And then way up the top, there's that little yellow box pointing to a tiny little dot, and that's 2.5 microns in size. All of this to say that particulate matter, PM 2.5, very, very small. And the reason that that matters is that when you are outdoors in a lot of smoke and a lot of this particulate matter, and you're exercising, you're breathing deeply, you can inhale that very deeply into your lungs. Small particles can get very deep into your lungs, and it can cause irritation and coughing and that sort of thing in the short term, but much more serious effects in the long term. And so, so we want to measure it, we want to understand it. So we have the air quality index, which we talked about in the trivia. And this helps DEQ figure out how much is too much. And really, when we're looking at this, we're looking for areas that are going to get over 100. It's kind of a neutral unit. A lot of things go into the air quality index, but so it's just 100. When it's over 100 or reaching unhealthy for sensitive groups for a sustained period of time, that's when we start issuing air quality advisories. And unhealthy for sensitive groups means children, seniors, pregnant women, people with respiratory issues. And then you can see as the colors get sort of more red and darker, it becomes more unhealthy for more people. And essentially that has to do with kind of the density of smoke, the density of particulate matter. You can kind of imagine like a visual index that as we get to hazardous towards more maroon, that the smoke is getting thicker and thicker. And so in September 2020, today, green day, air quality is looking good. But this is what the map of air quality monitors look like in September 2020. And this was the worst air quality, worst wildfire event Oregon has seen in its history, at least the history in which we've been measuring air quality. And up and down the I-5 corridor, you see purple, you see maroon, you see red. And really, now if we're going to talk about risk, what this map means is that you should not be going outside and exercising. Unless you live in the mid to south coast, you don't want to go outside and breathe deeply. It's a little bit of time maybe, but this was pretty dangerous smoke that I'm sure a lot of us remember. However, this map is also an excellent tool for information that everyone here can use. As my presentation says, there is an app for that. There's an app that you can all have called Oregon Air. You can download it on your phones right now. And you should super do that. It's on iPhone. It's on Android. It's very exciting. You can see all of the monitors across. Oregon and look at the trends over time and evaluate whether smoke and air quality is going up, going down, and it'll have a little banner to tell you if there are air quality advisories in any location. Additionally, we have the Oregon Smoke Log, and that will give you all of the actual advisories and a lot of links to really helpful information. Gov Delivery is sort of like the state of Oregon's listserv. And if you sign up for the air pollution advisories through DEQ, you can get a text or an email anytime one of these goes out. And you can follow us at OR Smoke Info on Twitter as well. That's how you also want to get this information. A lot of people join us on Twitter for the summer, and it's really handy to just have it in any one of these ways in your pocket. So also, what are we going to do about this? Because I know that's a lot of information to take in. It seems like a lot of burden on Oregonians and a lot on all of you. So we're all getting smoke ready and getting prepared for smoke. And so agencies like DEQ, but Oregon Health Authority and the Oregon Department of Forestry, we're all working on different ways to address this issue. One is prescribed burning. So this is called a lot of things, but essentially it means burning on purpose. And the reason we do this is that not burning for a long time can create fuel on the ground, and then that creates bigger fires, more smoke for a longer period of time. And so by burning on purpose under controlled conditions where we know what the weather is going to be, we have firefighters on scene, means that we can prevent some of those bigger fire events. And then in those places, we create smoke management plans where we work with the community to figure out how can we let you know when there's going to be smoke, if there's going to be smoke, the fact that this isn't a wildfire, or if a fire does crop up, how do we make sure that everyone here is informed, especially in certain places where there might be limited Wi-Fi access or something like that. And local public health agencies are also working on creating clean air spaces. So these are spaces like in schools and libraries where people can go where the air is clean and circulated through a system. And this can be for folks who maybe don't have a place to go if the air quality gets really bad, and for the houseless population that also might need to get indoors during those times that are either really hot and or very smoky. And then you can also get smoke ready. So we had this trivia question about MERV 13 filters. So if you live in a place with any sort of air conditioning, either you have a full air conditioning system or you have a window unit, you can get at Home Depot or online a MERV 13 filter. It's on the filter as a little grade, and that will improve the air quality during those times. You don't need to use it all the time or it'll really work your system very hard, but have a stack on hand. If you don't have air conditioning, that's okay. You can even like DIY your own air filter. through the Oregon Smoke blog. There are like YouTube links on how to do that. You can get air filters, but essentially like you want where you sleep, for example, to be a pretty clean airspace because you're breathing deeply and you're just staying in that room a lot of the time. And then the other thing I would recommend is just kind of making that plan B. If it's going to be smoky, do you have friends or family, any people that you can go and stay with them for a little bit, a way to escape smoky air? And then if you're going to, I know, even on really rainy weeks like this, I'm thinking a lot about when it's going to be sunny, when I can go outside and go hiking and just be outdoors again. But it's good to have a plan B if it's going to be smoky during those times, to think about what will I do if the air quality is poor? How can I do something that's less, cardiovascularly intensive so that I'm not doing some deep breathing during those smoky times? And so if you're really interested in everything air quality, DEQ does have a podcast called Green States, and the first 3 episodes are on wildfire smoke and air quality. So you can dig really deep. You want to hear me talk more about recycling and EV rebates and all of the different things. It's pretty fun, and it's something we're trying out. So thank you. Yeah.
So when we talk about people being exposed to, like last summer, to unhealthy air or, worse, do you get a sense of, does that have a short-term impact on health, potential long-term impact? Is there any kind of assess what that really means in terms of, and of course it depends on where you fall in the population, if you're sensitive or not sensitive. But I'm just wondering if there's a way to kind of get a sense of what that really means in terms of health risk.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, is there a way to understand when the air is unhealthy or very unhealthy, what the impacts are both short-term and long-term on different communities? So I take my best stab at this as not an Oregon Health Authority person, but I would say, so I had a graphic that showed in the short term, you have most likely, because typically smoke is not really a persistent issue, the way that things that are more cancer causing tend to be. Those tend to be things that are very, very persistent. By persistent, I mean years. And so typically it would be more like in the short term, it would be coughing and that sort of thing. But that's why something like an organization like Oregon OSHA that creates occupational standards, that's why they're doing things for communities whose job it is to work outside, creating regulations for people who are going to experience more long-term exposures, where risk equals exposure times toxicity. If you're going to be more exposed, we got to worry about those long-term exposures. So it kind of depends. I'd say for the general population, you'll probably have that short-term cough, but make sure to not overexpose yourself by going running when it's unhealthy conditions outside, and then you should be okay in the long term. But when you are a more exposed or a sensitive population, you want to be really careful because you can experience some long-term risk.
Yeah, there's an old saying in toxicology, which is the dose is the poison.
Right.
So if you're exposed for a short time, then maybe you won't have a long-term effect. But if you're exposed to a higher dose for a longer period of time, it may be a different story. So try to minimize that exposure in unhealthy conditions to minimize long-term risk.
Yeah, the dose makes the poison. I have heard that one before. That's a good method to live by. Yes.
I was wondering if you had given any consideration to, once the smoke settles, what sort of contamination that could lead to around properties or people's backyards that were being affected by structure fires that occurred positive, that way.
Yeah, so the question is about whether DEQ is looking into issues of smoke deposition. So when the smoke filters down and then lands on properties or water bodies or whatever, how that all gets evaluated and cleaned up. So a couple of answers to that. I mean, there are many ways that DEQ regulates various things like water quality, and Oregon Health Authority regulates drinking water. And so there's testing that ensures that all of those things are safe. But then I'll say during the 2020 wildfires, we certainly experienced many people's homes being destroyed by fires. And DEQ was heavily involved in the process of removing hazardous materials from people's property before a larger cleanup happened, and then testing soil to make sure that it was safe for rebuilding. Does that answer your question?
You know, a little bit. I guess I was projecting more beyond the soil. Let's say there's a community, like Detroit, for example, or just, place where there was a lot of structures that were burned. And, my understanding is more focused on, individual lots are still with that. There's more smoke kind of going beyond those communities, the border, like people need to recreate, not necessarily. It's a pretty abstract question.
Yeah, no worries. No, asking about, just kind of smoke deposition generally. I don't, Kaci, do you have something to add? Fabulous.
Just one fun fact to share is that OSU is doing work on smoke deposition on grapes because of wine, of course, and we can taste all those weird things. And so what can we do to treat the grapes to get the stank off? But as far as deposition, like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, we're expecting smoke would be full of them, would be dropped on soil. I'm not aware of any work that's going on to quantify the risk of that deposition or to manage it.
I've talked to people a lot of times, we need the regulatory framework, which I think folks have pointed to today in order to move forward with things like that. And it's a very good question, but I don't think there is a framework to address greater deposition. Question, and then I see you.
Oh, yeah. Is the PM 2.5 air quality index specifically determined for Oregon, or is it a national index?
Okay. So the question is PM 2.5 index, the air quality index, that meter, specific to Oregon, or is it a national index? It's a national index. It's what EPA uses. You could also go to airnow.com or org or Google Air Now, and you'll get to the same thing. Even DEQ's Air App and the Oregon Smoke Log will show you more monitors than just what's in Oregon. It's the same meter that's used nationally.
It's one thing to know what the solution is to mitigate major wildfires. The gorilla in the room is have Washington, Oregon, and California agreed to stump up the money to do all the underbrush clearing and prescribed burns to make a dent in mitigating major wildfires.
Okay, yeah. So the question is, when it comes to managing wildfires and mitigating wildfires, have Oregon, Washington, and California coordinated to make sure that the clearing of underbrush and prescribed burning is enough to actually mitigate larger wildfires?
And are they putting the money into it?
Yes, and are they putting the money into it? So you'll have to forgive me because I'm not our legislative person, but there was a wildfire bill that just got passed that was specifically for prescribed burning and addressing a number of wildfire issues, but prescribed burning was one of them, and that's why DEQ now has funding and the ability to start hiring people to really address this issue. I can't speak specifically to exactly what our coordination with California and Washington is on this. Some of this kind of traipses into Oregon Department of Forestry territory. So I can't speak quite on behalf of them, but I would say certainly for Oregon, and it doesn't benefit us financially to not do this because the cost of doing preventative measures like prescribed burning is so much less than the cost that in property and in obviously human lives and human impact. There are people still living in their FEMA trailers now from the 2020 wildfires. And it was the most expensive disaster in Oregon history. So I can't imagine a cost in prevention that wouldn't be worth a pound of cure in this instance. Yeah.
So we learned in the quiz section or the trivia about the air quality monitors. There's like 13 of them or so.
DEQ one.
Sure.
DEQ.
They're not air monitors.
Yeah, no, so I was wondering, like, are they like, what's up with them? Are they like in like little like boxes, like stuck inside the building or something? Like, should I drive around and like see them? Who maintains them? I just want to learn more about what they are.
Okay, so the question was about the 13 air quality monitors that are in the Portland metropolitan area. What are they, generally speaking? And so the answer to that is there are actually a number of things. So some of them are PM 2.5 monitors. They're monitoring just that particulate matter. Some of them are monitors that are required through the Environmental Protection Agency, and they measure a whole suite of chemicals, and that comes out in a whole annual report. So there are a number of things, but siting, and I'm glad you brought this up, is a really important topic. And as we're placing new monitors all the time, it's something we really look at. We look at, geographic equity to be sure. But even just things like if anyone's ever put a thermometer up on the side of their house and then realize they accidentally put it on something metal, and when the sun shines, it's suddenly 150 degrees, we need to make sure that we're not measuring air quality in a way that gives you, either false positives or whatever the opposite of that is. And so, so that's where siting becomes really important. And that's where we spend a lot of time is we're trying to put new monitors in place. So, they just kind of look like a pole with like a box on them. The box contains a bunch of air sampling equipment. A lot of these maps, including ours, you might have heard about purple air monitors. Our map will put those through a calculation that sort of calibrates them to be in line with the air quality index. So they're a little bit more reliable. But the funky thing about purple air monitors is they're something you can go buy and you don't know exactly where a person is putting it. They might be doing the equivalent of the metal on the side of their house.
Someone wants to know, with smoke in the air, are you exposed when you're in your car?
With smoke in the air, are you exposed when you're in your car? You can be. And so the important thing to remember there is to put your car on recirculate if you're going to be driving. And again, as someone pointed out, the dose makes the poison. So if you're going on really long car trips through really smoky areas, when it's really, really bad, that's problematic. But if you're going on a short trip to the grocery store, you're probably going to be fine. But still, set your car to recirculate, the pro tip. Yes.
I wanted to ask about masks. Like if I have to go outside during one of these unhealthy times, if we all have masks now, and I just put on a surgical mask, will that help? Or can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, we all have masks now. You might hear that protecting yourself from smoke can be done with a mask. What does that really mean? Does the mask I'm wearing right now, I don't know if you can see me in the camera, does that work? Does that count? And the answer, your general COVID mask, although this definition may have changed. So you need to wear an N95 mask and one that fits. That is what you need for smoke. Generally speaking, I would say that doesn't mean if the air is hazardous, go running in your N95 mask. Please do not do that. That's just not great air quality. But if you're worried about smoke and you do really want to protect yourself, N95 one that's fitted to you or one that is fitting and sealing well will protect you against smoke. The kind of run of the mill, COVID mask to just keep, those droplets in is not what we're looking for. Yeah.
How does DEQ determine which substances in water are considered unsafe?
How does DEQ determine which substances in water are considered unsafe?
Ooh, I could do that one.
Oh man, we got a guess answer. Oh man, it's like all in the air quality zone. Well, okay, so fact check me because this is a little off the cuff. So I mean, a lot of what we consider safe comes down from EPA, comes down from things like the Clean Water Act, and so that is typically, there are certain levels at which things have to be safe. When we're asking this question, how much is too much, especially when you're regulating, you do have to draw a line somewhere, and sometimes that line moves. But yeah, I would say generally it's passed down from the EPA. Others who work with, okay, I'm getting a thumbs up from the audience, so it's a fact. Everyone shoot that now. Yes, more on Zoom.
This is more back to the air quality again. Does DEQ test for benzene in the air in industrial Northwest Portland where the gas storage tanks are?
All right. I can't answer this.
I want to know.
Repeat the question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I knew I would forget. So does DEQ test for benzene in the air in Northwest Portland where the gas tanks are? That's a great question. I know what has been referred to as the critical energy infrastructure hub is a major topic, it's a major piece of legislation. And so the first thing that would be required, I would say, is that, like I said, some of the air quality monitors are for particulate matter only. And that means they are not testing for benzene. Those are not synonymous terms. If you look at, the output essentially of any one of those monitors, they're not going to tell you that answer. But these, I think we call them like trend monitors that stay in the same location for a long, long period of time and are related to EPA. Those do test for benzene. And then we also have a couple ones that rotate around the state, and they're on a schedule based on some of those things I was talking about, like geographic equity and coverage and understanding air quality around the state. And we have not done that in Northwest Portland. But we have talked to community members from the Linton Neighborhood Association who I know are very interested in that. So that space, that area of the city is on our list. Yes.
It would appear we learned a lot from the bullseye glass observations of the roof moss and the accumulation of toxic chemicals. What have you guys done to amplify that and collect more data around the state?
That's a great question. So the question is, DEQ has learned a lot from the bullseye glass incident, and which really came with a lot of that data came out of moss sampling, and what have we done to do basically gather more information like that. So to my knowledge, we have not done more moss sampling. However, what we have done is, I think between that time and now, we created our own brand, I guess, essentially of air quality monitors called SenseOrs, because we're clever, and OR like Bergen, and essentially that is something where we've really revved up the number of air quality monitors we have. So, of course, the idea being to gather more data around the state, and then the movement of these various air quality monitors to get more and more data. But we have not done more MOS specific things. And then we do have, of course, Cleaner Air Oregon, which came out of the bullseye glass event, and that goes through every single existing and new facility and does something that, to my knowledge, no other state does, which is build on top of the Clean Air Act and say, okay, so not only do we want to hear about these pollutants, I don't know how many it is for the Clean Air Act, but we want to hear about hundreds and hundreds, I think it's over 600 different toxics. We want to know what you put out, and then we're going to look at who lives nearby, who works nearby, who's at a park nearby, and what is their risk. And then we're going to regulate you specifically based on that risk. So going through those really in-depth analyses is a major way that we're regulating existing facilities, but then every new facility that gets an air quality permit. Any more DEQ questions?
When are you gonna cover water quality in the Green City?
Next. As it turns out, you talk to me about the Green State podcast anytime. We're going to be talking to the new water quality administrator, Jennifer Weigel. She's fabulous. And talking about total maximum daily load, which is something I don't quite understand. And so, but we'll all understand more after that podcast. So it's coming out next. So, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. It's a crazy thing to say. Okay. I think we're good. All right, thank you.
I just want to say again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you on Zoom, and thank you here for all the really great questions. I just want to encourage everyone to take what they've learned here, go home, share it with your friends. Science only works when we share it with each other. And thank you very much. Quick reminder, if you did get 7 or 8 in the trivia, I will be out at the table in about 1 minute. I just need to quickly wrap up things here to get your prizes. And let's thank our speakers again.